Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of mahauliyati, mukalmay. Today we have the pleasure of being joined with a very, very special guest, Mr. Ian Fry. Mr. Ian Fry is the current serving Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. He's an international environmental law and policy expert, and his focus has primarily focused on mitigation policies and loss and damage associated with the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, and related instruments. Mr. Fry has worked for the Tuvalu government for over 21 years and was appointed as their ambassador for climate change from 2015 to 2019. Mr. Fry has also represented the Tuvalu government at numerous international fora, including the World Summit on Sustainable Development, the Commission for Sustainable Development, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, the Convention on Biodiversity, the United Nations General Assembly, and the United Nations Small Island Developing States Conferences. Mr. Fry also teaches part-time at the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University. He specializes in international environmental policy and in environmental law. So, Mr. Fry, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So what we want to talk about today is this relationship between human rights and climate change. And of course, as the first Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, I'd like to hear a little bit about how exactly this interaction between human rights and climate change works, and what specific human rights are we talking about?
Well, the climate change has an enormous effect on human rights. So across the world, people are suffering from climate change, and therefore they're suffering, the loss of, for some people, the loss of life, the right to water, the right to sanitation, to housing, to health, are all connected to climate change impacts. So there's quite a broad spectrum of human rights violations that are occurring as a consequence of climate change.
And so there's this discussion about mitigation being the first area of climate change we should look at, because until we tackle mitigation, losses and damages will continue to increase and adaptation will get harder and harder. So within the mitigation field, how exactly do reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and carbon removal, how do those affect the human rights of individuals?
Well, there are two sides to that, I guess. The more action is taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then the less we're going to have human rights violations. So, the action. So, there's certainly not enough action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and so that's part of what I'm looking at as to how to accelerate action on climate change. But the other side of the coin is that there are certain mitigation actions that also have human rights implications. So, for instance, I met with Indigenous peoples at the last climate change COP, and they told me of various, climate change mitigation actions that are affecting their human rights. Hydroelectric dams is one of them. So I met with people from the Amazon basin, and the development of hydroelectric dams as a mitigation technology is affecting their human rights, because it's affecting their rights to water. It's displacing them from their land as the land gets inundated. That's a common story around the world with hydro dams, is that there are distinct human rights implications for those. I met with the Sami people in the Arctic region, and they're traditional herders of reindeer, and they're concerned about the development and location of wind turbines. So the Swedish government, for instance, is locating wind turbines on their land, on the Sami land, and that's affecting the reindeer herds. And the roads that go into those areas is affecting, reducing their land, and so therefore that's having an impact on them. So, they're just a couple of these sort of mitigation technologies. And of course, the other one is around deforestation and reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, which is a program that's been developed under the Climate Convention. And there are different views about that, whether that's actually reducing emissions, but also is it attributing a value to trees, a carbon value to trees, which is taking away the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so there are quite strong views around the whole issue of reducing emissions from deforestation. What are the human rights implications of those?
Mm-hmm. So in this area, it's not just about noting the relationship between human rights and climate change, it's about balancing those, because often human rights will be in contention with each other, and certain actions will have externalities on those human rights.
Yes, that's right. So, and it's also, as we're moving towards electronic vehicles and batteries, the mining of lithium is another one where there are significant human rights violations in the mining industry. So that's another one. We have to be mindful of these things. In the region where I come from, in the Pacific, there's proposals for deep seabed mining to extract minerals for this whole electronic business. And there will be, if it's allowed, have significant human rights implications because of the churning up of the bottom, destruction of biodiversity is going to have a serious human rights implications with that.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to go now to loss and damage, and particularly the non-economic losses and damage, which at least academics have spoken about as this area that's often ignored because you can't put a monetary value or try to use this monetary system to understand the loss of culture, the loss of social cohesion, the anxiety that results from the loss and damage from slow onset events or sudden events. So how are we at measuring that, and how are we going about including non-economic loss and damage in our understanding of the losses that are taking place today?
Well, this is a real challenge to quantify it and to have active measures to deal with it. For instance, an example, going back to the Pacific, Tuvalu is losing grave sites as a consequence of sea level rise and storm surges. So that's a clear non-economic loss as a consequence of climate change. And how do you put a value on losing a relative, from a grave? And these are some of the issues that are challenging, and how do you compensate somebody for that loss? There's no real economic compensation that can be provided, but we have to be mindful of those losses. And I guess once we see those losses, then it might accelerate action to reduce the impacts in the first place. But it's very hard to quantify these non-economic losses or provide some sort of compensation for those.
So how is this issue being dealt with at climate negotiations?
It's a real challenge. The Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage has a particular work program looking at these non-economic losses, but there isn't a lot coming out of that discussion at the moment. It's certainly, people are aware of these non-economic losses, but what do you do about them is the real challenge.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also important here that our traditional, I guess the elite that are involved in negotiations or policy decisions in countries, perhaps they also don't have the best understanding of non-economic losses and damages, where Indigenous communities and those most impacted by climate change are the ones who can better articulate what these are. So are we successful in getting these voices to international forums? Are we successful in giving them a platform that is actually meaningful without being just symbolic?
Well, again, that's the real challenge. The Climate Convention has a local communities and Indigenous peoples platform, which provides an opportunity for local communities and Indigenous peoples to present their views. But I attended one of those meetings last year, and I just wasn't convinced that it was a useful platform for bringing forward the concerns, particularly of Indigenous peoples and their loss of cultural knowledge as a consequence of climate change, and what the international community should be doing about that. So there is still a big gap between, particularly Indigenous peoples and their knowledge and getting the international community to be aware of that and to take action on that. I mean, because there are a lot of sensitivities around the whole issue of Indigenous peoples. Like I was in Bangladesh last year on a country visit, and the Bangladesh government doesn't recognise Indigenous peoples. They call them small ethnic minorities, and so there's not even the recognition of Indigenous peoples, and therefore there's no acceptance of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is a critical area, and so there are still challenges around that issue as well, in getting adequate recognition of Indigenous peoples, and of course. Other countries are concerned about sovereignty issues, claims of Indigenous peoples, and where I come from in Australia, there are, a serious lack of recognition of Indigenous people's rights.
And something that I noticed in Pakistan is at least we're now coming to realize that Indigenous knowledge on the environment is valuable, and that community-based solutions that prioritize the community that is being affected are the ones that are most successful, especially in disaster situations with early warning systems. So we're slowly getting to that recognition of their importance and their need to inform us on how we need to go about this. But still, there's that implementation gap where we're not getting their voices heard on a large platform. And the hurdles that they have to go over to get their views across, share their knowledge, it's often, I would say, discouraging to them. So that's one area that I think we will see in the coming years, and I'm hoping that we'll get some meaningful progress on it.
Yes, and that's an ongoing debate, and it came up in the Biodiversity Convention with regimes for access and benefit sharing, and there was a lot of pushback from Indigenous peoples because we know that there are pharmaceutical companies sending in anthropologists to study traditional medicines. They extract the active constituents of those medicines and then patent them and then make lots of money. And the Indigenous people's knowledge is not recognised, commercially or the money doesn't flow back to the Indigenous peoples. And so this access and benefit sharing scheme is supposed to bring back that finances. But it's also an issue of, do Indigenous peoples want their knowledge to be shared, as in the public domain? So that's another issue as well.
And another great reason to have them on the table to hear what they want.
Absolutely.
And how involved they'd like to be in the process.
Yes.
So I'd like to pivot a little now to climate litigation. Pakistan is a good example of where rights-based litigation has really flourished, and with the Asr Nafari case, and then a lot of ongoing petitions in the courts. So I'd like to ask you whether you've noticed this as an effective strategy in the Global South, this use of human rights within environmental climate change litigation. Have you seen that in a lot of other states, and is it successful?
Well, to be honest, I think Pakistan is leading the field in this area. There isn't that connection between human rights and climate change issues. In fact, there is, in some areas, there's pushback on this issue. Certainly at the last climate change COP, there were negotiations to bring on board human rights language in some of the work programs, and there was pushback, particularly from some African countries on this issue. So there's a real sensitivity around human rights issues. And I think really Pakistan is doing an amazing job in leading the field and bringing forward rights around rights to water and things like that are well ahead of a lot of other countries in that area.
And so we've spoken about states, we've spoken about governments who implement these policies, about the communities, but now I'd like to push to a stakeholder that's often forgotten, which I'm sure they're happy about being sidelined. It's corporations. So we recognize that corporations and their business activities have a huge impact on communities and the environment, and yet they're not regulated under international environmental law the same way that states are. So I'd like to talk to you about how exactly we could go about regulating them and ensuring that they don't have free rein to damage what is in common good for everybody. And in particular, I want to hear a little bit about whether maybe the UNGPs on business and human rights would be the right avenue, or whether there's another regime under international law that could really cover this area of corporate accountability.
So yes, the UN, guiding principles on business and human rights is an important guide, but it's only soft law,
yeah.
and there's certainly business are aware of it, but I'm not sure there's a lot of adherence to those principles. I think we're seeing some useful work in the EU on environmental and social governance measures, and they're bringing in various directives around that. And the US is also bringing in directives and laws around environmental and social governance measures. So we're slowly seeing sort of inroads into this corporate accountability area, and I'm particularly interested in disclosure mechanisms. So we have a task force on disclosure, which is again created guidelines on disclosure, which are again soft law, and this is one of the issues I'm looking at as Special Rapporteur, is whether we do need to bring some of these soft law agreements into becoming hard law to make corporations accountable. And as far as climate change and human rights are concerned, we have to know where these financial institutions are investing their money particularly in fossil fuels, and they should be declaring so that the public can understand that their pension funds or insurance money or in these corporations, where they're spending their money, and are they underwriting climate change by doing that. And so we need stronger disclosure mechanisms to ensure that these financial institutions, the banks, etc., have to disclose where they're investing their money. And the order of magnitude of investment is enormous. And the oil companies are making enormous amounts of money, and they're able to, through that, buy influence. And certainly, Forbes magazine reported on a sort of House Committee on Energy that was held in the United States, and the oil companies appeared before that House Committee to account for themselves, but 10 out of the 19 members of the House Committee who are in Congress are sponsored by oil companies. So, there's a vicious cycle of protection of these industries, and we have to draw out that, protection mechanisms and create stronger laws to make business accountable.
Mm-hmm. And businesses have this really incredible skill of greenwashing
Yes.
whatever they're doing. So even their presence at COP and their funding of COP, sometimes they can put a haze in front of your eyes and you don't realize these are actually the biggest emitters, especially for biggest sources of plastic pollution with Coca-Cola last year. And then this year with in the UAE, we're likely to see involvement by oil companies, which is counterintuitive, I think, to the aims.
Absolutely, yes, and this is the real problem we have, is that we're seeing these corporations having so much influence over decision making, and we have to find ways of dealing with that and try and make them more accountable.
And is the system on the disclosure of investments, has that kind of developed as a result of the Aarhus Convention with the right to access information? Can you kind of extract those principles and apply that in this case?
I'm not sure whether was, because it's primarily European, and I think that has certainly helped drive Europe's move for that disclosure. And I think that's quite important. I think that one of the interesting areas is the Iguazu agreement on, right to know and knowledge and things like that. And I think we'll start to see that taking effect. I think in the US, I'm not sure what's been behind that. I think President Biden's wanted to, has seen the influence of these companies on vote buying, I guess, in some ways, and so that's why he's brought in some of these measures, and I think they're quite critical. We have to sort of link this to the environmental and social governance, so we have to see how corporations, what their human rights record is as well. And of course there are clearly a lot of sensitivities in developing countries around that sort of reporting measures, for reporting on human rights records for business is a challenging area, but it's critical that we do that. We know that there's a lot of child labour. We know that there is slave labour in industries. We only have to look at the textile industries in this part of the world to know that there's a lot of human rights abuses within those industries, and so it's a sensitive issue, and whether these corporations or governments are willing to regulate those, knowing how they bring in money to the country.
Yeah. I'd now like to get a little bit of advice for the state of Pakistan. You've negotiated on behalf of Tuvalu for many years. You've worked for the Tuvalu government for 21 years. You've been an ambassador for climate change and environment there. And Tuvalu has been very successful on the international stage, despite being such a small island state, in really highlighting the impacts of climate change that it's experiencing and bringing some really important issues to the table. So I'd like to hear, given the unique situation that Pakistan finds itself in, with the increased frequency and intensity of floods and of our heat waves as well, how can other states learn from Tuvalu's experience? I'm sure there were a lot of successes, failures, and a lot of hard work that went into that. So what are the areas that can be worked on? What are the best practices we should look out for?
Well, one thing I say that governments shouldn't be afraid to involve non-government organisations on their delegations, and if you see the really successful delegations, a lot of them have non-government representatives on them. So, we have some for small island states and for least developed countries, because Tuvalu is a least developed country, we've had a lot of support from International Institute for Environment Development, which those people are on delegations. There's another organisation called Climate Analytics, which is a German-based organisation, but also has people located in developing countries, and they come on delegations. And one thing I say, is that NGOs have a much better network of knowledge than governments do, because governments set up their silos, they don't talk to other governments, and whereas NGOs have a much better communication network and understand and get intelligence around different issues. And that's certainly helped small island states for a number of years. We used to have a Foundation for International Environmental Law and Development, a UK law firm, and we had lawyers from that NGO support the Alliance of Small Island States, and they were quite valuable. And interestingly enough, a lot of those lawyers have gone on. The chief negotiator now for the European Union was one of those lawyers who supported small island states. So, organisations like your own, could play a very critical role in supporting the government. And because you've got those networks and intelligence networks to understand what other countries are saying and things like that, and that's invaluable to be able to understand. And, you can tell somebody who's a negotiator who's had an NGO background, because they've got that, a way to cut corners and not be too rigid in their thinking that you learn if you're a bureaucrat. And that, from my own experience, I came from an NGO background, and that taught me how to cut corners, how to communicate with others, to find intelligence and so forth. And that helped me a lot in climate change negotiations.
Mm-hmm. And so you've kind of answered my next question with the silos in terms of which organizations or individuals or groups of stakeholders need to interact. But I want to talk a little bit about the areas in which we work. So climate change is a super wicked problem. It can't be solved by international lawyers alone. It can't be solved by bureaucrats alone. And it can't be solved by economists or even scientists. So, but often there isn't much conversation between these different fields, despite recognizing that climate change is an interdisciplinary issue and it's an issue for all of mankind that we have to address now. So how can we kind of promote that discourse between different disciplines to get that, so that we take the knowledge from each field and use that to tackle the issue that we face?
Yeah, well, you just got to break down those barriers and have conferences and dialogues, to have that exchange of views so people can understand the different issues. From my own experience in working in Pacific Island country, fisheries department are critical. The climate change is affecting fisheries, so we have to have that discussion with the fisheries department. And we before every COP we used to have a round table with all the departments and NGOs, so we could get the sort of breadth of views around the issues that were coming up for the COP, and this is critical. I do negotiation training, and preparation for the COPs is critical. That you reach out to the NGOs, reach out to their knowledge networks, reach out to other government departments, and get an exchange of views, so that you understand the issues that are there. Of course, you can't do everything, and so each country has to decide what is the critical issues that they want to cover. We just don't have the size of delegations to cover everything, and so the way the least developed countries worked, we'd have preparatory meetings. We'd identify somebody to be the spokesperson on different thematic issues. We'd meet amongst ourselves and we identify those people. But you have to have that sort of dialogue across different departments to make sure that everybody's on board and everybody understands what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And so we've talked about a lot of these different areas of human rights and climate change, but I'd like to end on the note with getting what you're most excited for with COP. What area are you looking forward to seeing progress on, what do you hope out of this next COP?
Well, to be honest, I don't have a lot of hope for this COP. The problem is that we're continuously having COPs located in fossil fuel exporting countries, and there's a institutional problem of why that's happening, and we have to fix that. To get countries that are the vulnerable countries hosting COPs. But COPs have become so big that you need the infrastructure, the tourism resorts, or whatever to be able to host people and so forth to do that. But I mean, that's a challenge. I think we're heading towards this global stock take, and I think I think that will be a real eye opener if we get the right sort of information. It'll be a real shake-up to the world. And so the next COP will be part of that process. I think that's critical. I think the work on the loss and damage fund will be critical as well as part of it. But, the trouble is we've got, the president of the COP works for a major oil exporting company. It's a challenge to get meaningful outcomes when we have fossil fuel interests so strongly embedded in the process.
So I imagine this year as well, negotiators will be working late into the night to make sure that we get more concrete language.
Yes, it's become a habit now. I used to say, this is every COP I went to. This is 3 weeks of torture. We had the preparatory meetings of the regional groups, so we had least developed countries and small arms states. We go into negotiations, and then the last week, at least the last few days, I don't get any sleep. The Madrid COP, I slept for 2 hours at the conference center the last night. And Paris, I didn't go home to my hotel for the last couple of nights. You just, you grab a little bit of sleep and that's it, and hope that there's food available at terrible hours of the night. So, yeah, it's a torturous process, being involved. And this is the other issue I try and teach in my negotiations training work is that you've got to be there for the long haul. You've got to have the stamina to be there at the critical moments. And for some countries they don't do that, and that's part of it. You've got to be there, willing to stay up late, right till the end.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really excellent to get the opportunity to speak to you about this, and I'm sure our audience would really appreciate your insights, and it's given them quite a bit to think about. So thank you. And to our audience, please join us for our next episode of mahauliyati.